Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. It is a very hot day today, so I apologise if I look a little bit shiny. I think it's supposed to be like 27 degrees today. I think it's only about 23 at the moment, but for someone who was born and raised in the north of England where it's like perpetually 9 degrees all year round, climate change is not my biggest fan. I'm not a fan of it, to be honest, because it just means the north of England is getting warm and that makes me uncomfortable physically and emotionally. So yeah, that's where I am. Anyway, enough about my seasonal discomfort. It's time to move on to talking about Queen Charlotte. And I've put a couple of pictures up on the back of my screen here just so that there's a little bit of background. But also I am going to be changing out these photos when I come on to talk about certain points of the show. Just thought it might help to have some like visual aids rather than me just kind of talking at you. So without further ado, let's jump into my reaction, my review of Netflix's Queen Charlotte. The Netflix show Queen Charlotte. There you go. Let's jump into talking about that. So overall, I absolutely loved this show. I really enjoyed it. I didn't really know what to expect, but I mean, anything with Shonda Rhimes is going to be incredible. I've been a huge fan of Shonda Rhimes' work for many years. I started watching Grey's Anatomy like 17 years ago when I went away to uni, which makes me feel incredibly old. And I just think that she's an incredible creator because I know she doesn't write the shows, but I'm sure that as the creator, she has a hand in kind of every aspect of bringing a show to life. And I think she just has some kind of magical quality, magical ability to create these incredible stories and to bring people's stories to life in a really kind of amazing way. One of the things I've always loved about Shonda Rhimes is her ability to have humour, even in shows that aren't supposed to be funny. Like Grey's Anatomy wasn't funny, but it had dark humour. Bridgerton, especially this story with Queen Charlotte, it's not supposed to be funny, but there are moments of humour in it, and I think that's what I like. It's the kind of her ability to talk about really serious and emotional topics. I cried in this show so many times, and I was warned. Everyone was like, get your tissues ready, you're gonna cry, and I was like, oh yeah, but I'm a cold-hearted bitch, I'm not gonna cry. And I did, totally did. But then also I literally laughed out loud so many times, and I find things funny, but it's very rare that I actually like properly laugh really hard at something, and I did at several moments in this show as well. So overall, I just absolutely loved it. I'll go on to talk about a few specific things, but overall I think they did a phenomenal job of taking this really sensitive topic about mental health and handling it in a really kind of interesting but not too heavy way. Like there are real heavy dark moments in it, but overall it's not just about that individual. It's not just about King George's experience with mental health. It's about the sphere around him, and I really loved that. I loved the fact that it looked at a wife's perspective of supporting a husband with mental health. It looked at a mother's perspective of having to bring up a child that has mental health and pressure and this, that and the other. And yeah, I absolutely loved it. I was really glad, one point I will make, I was really glad that they brought the scenes of the elder Queen Charlotte and also Lady Danbury and Lady Bridgerton into this series, because I was a little bit concerned as to how they were going to kind of blend the worlds together. And I thought that they did subtle hints that made it really clear that this series is supposed to be kind of set in the immediate aftermath of the end of season 2. And I liked that. They kind of just dropped it in like, I think it was like literally 1 or 2 sentences from Lady Bridgerton, and yet it completely set the world. And I thought that was really good. Overall, my favourite parts, some of my favourite parts of this entire series were with the older cast. And I loved this bit. I loved this kind of timeline with the younger Charlotte and King George. And I loved that, but I absolutely chef's kiss some of the moments with the older Queen Charlotte and the interactions between Lady Danbury and Lady Bridgerton talking about her garden and wanting to garden again. Oh, there were just so many incredible moments. So talking about the main storyline, I really loved the fact that it was a focus on George's mental health. And I think there's obviously a wider agenda here that Shonda Rhimes and the rest of the creators of the show wanted to have a very clear discussion about the history of mental health, because people assume that mental health is a modern thing, because us going to therapy, us as modern people seeking professional help for our mental health is a relatively modern concept. Even like 2 generations ago, my grandparents would never have dreamt of going to see a counsellor or a therapist to talk about their mental health. But actually, mental health problems have been around since people have been around. That it's not a modern concept, isn't mental health and having problems with mental health. And I think that's one of the things that I loved about the fact that they created this show, because it opens up the dialogue about historic mental health. I love the fact that they made reference to the death of Princess Charlotte, because I actually have covered her death. I do know a lot about her death actually, because it was in my first book when we were talking about midwives, and the fact that she died in childbirth, which was really sad. And she had like the best physicians available, and she still her life couldn't be saved. And that her death was what opened the door for Queen Victoria. And so I liked that. I really loved that kind of thread of, okay, this is where we are in Bridgerton and how it kind of references and fits in within the monarchy that we know. So I really loved that. I loved that kind of storyline. And my favourite moment, I've literally just put something on Instagram this morning about this. Sorry, I know it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is my favourite moment in the entire series, when Queen Charlotte pats her son on the shoulder and goes, sorrows, prayers. I just love it. I just love the fact that it's not funny. Obviously, her son is incredibly heartbroken at the death of his daughter, and it's really actually quite traumatic when you see the fact that the mother doesn't understand how to interact with their children, doesn't understand how to kind of comfort them. It's sad, but it's just the way it's been written. It's that dark humour again, and I absolutely love it. It's just so funny, and I love that people are making this into memes. So yeah, I loved that moment. But yeah, overall, I was really glad how they kind of put that storyline into it. I think that's probably one of the successes of this season, is that yes, you do have the overarching storyline of Charlotte and George and their love story, but you have all these other kind of little side stories, and I think that's usually the sign of a really good writer and creator, is that they can put subplots and other stories interlaced in, and you don't feel like you're missing anything from the main storyline, or it doesn't feel rushed. Yeah, the only storyline that I think they did a bit dirty was the storyline of Reynolds and Brimsley. Like, I absolutely loved their storyline, and I just feel like Shonda Rhimes and the other writers managed to drop so many little nuggets of other people's stories into this series that I really wish they'd done a little bit more about Brimsley and Reynolds. And apparently I have heard that a scene was filmed, but it was cut from the final show, which did show a little bit more of what happened in their relationship. And I'm really sad that they decided to cut that, because I feel like it needed a little bit more telling. Having said that, maybe they're going to explore it in future seasons. So I'm hoping that we see more of young Brimsley and Reynolds, or even old Brimsley telling us more about his relationship and how he came from being young Brimsley in love to old Brimsley on his own, because there's that really emotional scene where he's dancing on his own. That literally had me in floods of tears, where he's dancing and then all of a sudden he's dancing on his own, and it's just heartbreaking. Like, I want to know what happened. This was another moment that really made me laugh. It was when Lady Danbury and Queen Charlotte, the young versions, are talking about sex, and Lady Danbury is deciding to like draw out things for Queen Charlotte, and Brimsley stood at the back like absolutely like gobsmacked with the dog. And I think there's a moment where he like looks down at the dog, and it's just almost as if he's like wanting to protect the dog from hearing too much about sex. And again, it was just another moment where I absolutely laughed out loud, because it's just like the micro emotions on Brimsley's face are just absolutely spot on. So funny. And that was another thing that I really loved. I loved the kind of open conversation about what sex is. I absolutely thought it was perfect that they made Queen Charlotte not know anything about sex, because that's probably what it was like for the majority of young women when they married. Their mothers might have said a little bit of something, but very often, especially if you didn't have a female figure around at home before you married, you wouldn't know anything. And especially if you'd grown up, you know, at court, you know, in some ways, the kind of poorer families were a lot more informed about sex and about reproduction, because they either lived in the country and so they saw farm animals doing it, or everybody lived under one roof, and very often it wasn't uncommon for young children to hear their mum and dad having sex, and so they kind of understood it a little bit more than if you were at court and you were ensconced within a nursery and you never met anybody and you never went out into the countryside, and you would just have absolutely no concept of what reproduction was and what it took to make a baby. And I absolutely love that they included that in the show, and especially that Lady Danbury drew pictures, and then I love the kind of round circle moment when she finally her and George finally have sex for the first time, and he's like, do you know what happens? And she's like, yes, and I'm happy with it all, I know how it all works, although I don't fancy my head being banged against the headboard. And I laughed again so hard, because it was just the naivete, you know, she's there like, oh yeah, I know everything that's going on, but then in a split second just shows how naive she actually still is. And it's such a beautiful moment, and I think it was really well written to kind of show that you can be thrust into literally one of the most important roles in the world and still have this complete level of innocence. And I thought that was a really lovely moment as well. And another thing that I loved the discussion between Lady Danbury and Lady Bridgerton about Lady Bridgerton's kind of emerging sexuality. So we all know from watching the season 1 and 2 that her husband has died. They probably have said in the show how long it is since he died, but it's obviously supposed to be around a decade. And I never really thought about her remarrying, because again, something that I'm kind of researching a lot at the moment, because I'm writing my 3rd book about widows, is I just assumed that her character didn't want to remarry, didn't want to consider a new relationship, because when you become a widow in an elite kind of family, you have a sense of freedom that you've never necessarily had in the rest of your life before. And it brought power, it brought freedom, it brought independence. And we see that a little bit in Lady Danbury, in young Lady Danbury, when her husband dies, and she finally is like, oh, I can be me. And she talks about that. She talks about having absolutely no sense of who she was because she was married off so young. She was raised to be his wife. And so as soon as he dies, she gets this sense of freedom. And it's unsurprising then that when she's proposed to by Charlotte's brother, she doesn't want to give that up, because actually she's just going to become another man's property. So I liked that play, and I liked that kind of conversation about women's agency in marriage and out of marriage, before marriage, after marriage. There's all that kind of discussion about women's kind of status at the time. And I think knowing all of that, I just assumed that Lady Bridgerton didn't want to remarry and that there was just no story of it. But then I loved how they brought this in. I loved how they kind of brought it in that her garden was blooming again. I loved all the kind of innuendo and the way that they spoke about it, because it's a very intimate thing to speak about, especially at that time when they didn't really have open, intimate conversations. And again, they're a slightly older generation, probably didn't talk about it as much. And I love that they have this kind of like slightly awkward moment, and Lady Bridgerton's hugely embarrassed by her own sexuality, but they talk about it, and it's really interesting. I would really love it. I don't think they talk about the menopause. I don't think they go that far, but I think that would be a really interesting thing if they could bring that into one of the Bridgerton shows, would be to actually then discuss late-term sexuality around the menopause and what it means to kind of go through that change in life, because that is one of the biggest physical changes that older women have in their lives, and yet nobody talks about it. It's very little research. There's all sorts of different layers of female kind of history, that's what I'm saying, and I love the fact that they have explored that more within Bridgerton. They've kind of explored that whole kind of diversity of female experience. I think that is a really, really exciting thing to have done within the context of this show, because they kind of lure people in with the love story and then explore some really important and thought-provoking questions. But the final thing I will mention is obviously the interaction with the Doctor, because this is something that forms a huge part of George's kind of story and George's narrative in the show. And I liked the way that they showed Charlotte's experience of the first days of marriage and then flipped it in the later episodes and showed George's experience. But then obviously in the kind of the middle and the latter half, it's all about George trying to improve himself, for Charlotte, trying to heal himself, trying to cure himself so that he can be the king that he wants to be, that his family have put the pressure on him to be, and also the husband that he wants to be to Charlotte. And I think that was a really interesting kind of narrative. I don't know how much of the Doctor's story is historically accurate in the show, but he was treated by several doctors, was George. And we know historically that doctors had all of these different kind of fad cures, these kind of crazy treatments that they said would cure madness, or that's what they called it at the time, or different ranges of illnesses, things like bloodletting. It was obviously a very kind of famous one, leeching. But I think it was really interesting that they showed these other kind of styles of treatment as well, like the cold water baths. And some of it you can kind of see, you can see flickers of modern mental health treatment. You can see flickers that he's like, he gets some little bits right, but then goes so wildly off in other places. And the fact that he like tries to control the king obviously isn't right. But like right at the beginning, I do think it was very kind of oversimplified. Like he went over and he just spoke to George once and George suddenly came out of a trance. Obviously that's not realistic to life, but it does show that talk therapy often can be one of the most kind of successful forms of therapy for mental health problems. And I think I liked that they kind of hinted at that. And there are things like, you know, having a routine, eating healthily, although they don't eat healthily, it's like simply is the way that they go in this. And I think that is, there's little elements of that you can say, okay, well that seems understandable as a routine, but then it goes just so wildly off. I think that's the whole point, is how George is so vulnerable and is so kind of manipulated and abused by this doctor and by people around him. The only person who does see him for who he is and genuinely kind of wants him to be himself is Charlotte. So there are two final points that I will make. One is that there is a point in, I don't know if it's episode 5 or episode 6, where King George says, my mother wrote me, or my mother's written me. And I just cringed instantly, and it completely broke the fourth wall, because that is an Americanism. We in England don't say, he wrote me, like he wrote me, or my mother wrote me. That's not how we say it. We say, my mother's written to me, or someone has written to me, or I've had a letter from my mother, or my mother's written to me. That's how we say it. And so it immediately told me that the show was American. It told me that there were American writers, and it was such a tiny moment, but for the kind of next 10 minutes, that's all I could think about, and it broke the fourth wall. So that was one tiny thing that I didn't like. And the final point I will make is that Shonda Rhimes absolutely broke my heart with the ending, with the very, very last moments of the last episode, when George looks at her and he says, you didn't go over the wall. Oh, I could cry now thinking about it. It was just such a beautiful full circle way to end the series, because I was thinking, how are they going to end this? You know, really their story's only just starting. And I thought that was really, really beautifully handled. Those kind of, the intimate moment when they're under the bed together and he just looks at her, and like I said, the last thing's that you didn't go over the garden wall, and it's just, oh, absolutely beautiful writing. So that's it. I've got a right job on my hands now, trying to edit this down to a small video. So thank you very much for watching. If you've watched this point, thank you, because I do put a lot of effort into making these videos, and it's really lovely when people watch them and watch them all the way through and enjoy them. So thank you very much. Let me know what you thought of Queen Charlotte. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you've watched this far and you're not already subscribed, please do, because that means by staying this far in the video that you are enjoying my content, and maybe you've already watched another video of mine. And so by hitting the subscribe button, it just shows me that you are enjoying my content, and it means that we can grow the community, and the more followers, the more subscribers I get, the more content I'm able to do for YouTube. So, and yeah, if you are already subscribed, thank you so much. You know how much I appreciate you. Please hit the like button, because that always helps. So if you're already subscribed, you can like it. So yes, thank you very much for watching this video. Take care, stay safe. Bye guys.